Okay, so on to the second kind of chunk of my lecture about where is medieval Scandinavia. And, as the sign says, I'm talking about Vikings, circa 9th century AD to 11th century AD. And Vikings they have a brand image, everyone's heard of the Vikings, everyone's got images of the Vikings, which I'm not too concerned to try and unpack at this moment. The main thing I'd like to bring up actually is that Vikings are much less relevant to understanding medieval Scandinavian literature than might at first be assumed. But they are still quite important, not necessarily perhaps in the ways you would expect. Our medieval Icelandic literature, to much lesser extent the literature of the other Scandinavian countries, insofar as there is any, our medieval Icelandic literature talks a lot about people in the Viking Age, and people who we would label as Vikings. They use the word Vikingur quite a lot, though not always for the same people that we might use it for. It basically means pirate in Old Icelandic. Vikingur, pirate. So the literature talks a lot about these people. However, the Vikings themselves, people in this period, Scandinavian people up to about the 11th century, weren't writing very much literature of their own, hardly any. I'll come on to that point a bit more in a bit. But it's really important to understand that Vikings aren't the people who are writing stuff. And when we have texts about Vikings, as we often do, they're written long after those people actually lived. So Vikings are partly important to understanding medieval Scandinavian literature because medieval Scandinavians write about them, not because those writers actually were them. And Vikings are important as well because they and the period in which they exist is a key period in Scandinavian history in several ways. The key one really being Scandinavia's relationship with Christianity, which is something that I'm going to come on to in the third video. So let's get the Vikings set up anyway and make sure that we're in the picture. But at the same time, we don't want to get too hung up on Vikings. They're a little bit of a red herring in their way, albeit a very famous and kind of easily marketed red herring, without wishing to press the analogy unduly. Okay. You've probably seen maps like this before. I think I must have just got this one off the web a good old while ago. It's pretty traditional sort of what the Vikings got up to map. And people in what's now Sweden basically went east and they followed the mighty river systems of the Österveger. You've heard of Northveger, the northern route. They went down the Österveger, the eastern route, down to the Black Sea and Constantinople. And you may have heard of the Varangians, the Varangian Guard, a bunch of bodyguards who were employed by the Emperor of Constantinople, the Roman Emperor, as he saw himself, to sort of, his bodyguards to look after him. Mighty Scandinavian types with big axes, at least in the kind of popular imagination. And they come up in sagas too. And then we've got all these kind of Norwegians who allegedly go round the top, harassing people in what's now northern Russia. And over to Iceland, settling Iceland, and onto Greenland, and of course onto what's now Canada. Action in the British Isles as well, allegedly also from these Danes, and lots of significant numbers of Scandinavians also making it into the Mediterranean world by the western route. And I wouldn't want to get too hung up on the particular arrows and particular directions they're going from. Everything's clearly much more complicated than that. Folks from Sweden definitely winding up in England. Folks doing kind of grand tours around all of the Scandinavian region and beyond. So that rather sort of traditional Victorian kind of arrows and invasions looking map is not necessarily that helpful. But nonetheless, it gives a rough idea of the scope of Scandinavian activity and settlement in this period. And it's of course of defining importance for Iceland because it's during the Viking period in the 9th century that Iceland gets settled by Scandinavian speakers. And although there may be one or two exceptions, it's more or less the first time it's settled by people at all. Plenty of Vikings in the British Isles as well, and I've said already that parts of Scotland were ruled by the King of Norway in consequence of some of this activity. So and chunks of England and bits of Ireland, Scotland, places like the Isle of Man become to at least a significant extent Old Norse speaking. As do parts of Normandy and so forth. So it's really important to be willing to kind of understand Scandinavia in very broad terms in this period. Norse speakers live quite widely around Europe, and sometimes they rule it. I mean, England winds up being ruled by King Canute, who was a Dane, and so forth. That said, the Scandinavian world that we'll be looking at in Icelandic literature, medieval Icelandic literature, is a rather different world. Okay, cool. Well, what does the Viking world look like then? Where do our ideas of this cultural coherence come from? We have those later texts, which we'll look into more. We have texts written at the time, not by Scandinavians, but by other people, like the English and the Franks, the people who live in what's now called France. And they, of course, have their own stories to tell, their own biases, their own concerns. They're interested in the effects of Viking activity rather than the kind of motivations, and that sort of distorts how they present what Scandinavians are up to. But crucially, on top of all that, we've got archaeological evidence, stuff you dig out of the ground. Here, rather unhelpfully, I'm not quite sure why I've put it in this format, but anyway, is a map of the Orkney Islands, just off the north of Scotland. There's the top of Caithness. And we'll be looking at a site that's spelt Bursey, and I've got this vague recollection it's pronounced Brescia, but I can't remember now. So apologies to any Orkney Islanders listening in. You can look at the archaeology in this region, and we start to find around the 9th century and onwards great big settlements. Here's a kind of large-scale view of Brescia, and here with the orientation turned round, so this little point corresponds to this point here. These amazing settlements of Viking Age houses with that characteristic bowed wall, that kind of slightly ship-shaped house. I've used this example from Orkney partly to illustrate the kind of extent of Scandinavians' movements, but also because on these islands they happen to be building using stone. The buildings survive really well, but you can dig these up in archaeological sites quite widely in other circumstances. In fact, I should show you some of those just to prove my point. Here's another angle of the Brescia settlement, and you can see these kind of low dry stone walls, and obviously in their time they had roofs on. Here we are on the Faroe Islands, a place which I would pronounce as Leirvik. I don't know quite how the Faroe Islanders say it, so apologies to any people who know Faroese who are listening. And yet again, you can see that characteristic longhouse shape with the bowed walls, and there's a hearth marked in the middle of this particular excavation. Wall round here marking probably the Eldhus, the kitchen, the firehouse literally, and other evidence for outhouses. Interesting, complex settlement, but fundamentally built around this characteristic house shape. And these settlements can be found more widely than that as well. Here we've got an extra example of a reconstructed house. This one is made of wood and turf, from Haukadalur, which you saw a photo of earlier, one of the fjords or dales, valleys of western Iceland. And so that's what they probably look like, at least to a certain extent, above ground. I can't remember if I've got a picture of the actual remains of Eirik Staðir. Oh yeah, there's me standing sort of amidst this kind of low turf wall, which is all that survives of the alleged original 10th century building. So we've got Iceland, we've got the Faroes, we've got the Orkney Islands, and we could find examples of very similar kinds of buildings in Norway and Denmark, if only I had pictures of them. So you're seeing these kind of characteristic building styles spreading out from the 9th century to about the 11th. He says, sounding faintly like a weatherman. Further examples. But these I've brought in to make the point that here on the Isle of Man, we've got one of these Scandinavian longhouses. Likewise here at Jarlshof in Shetland, amazing series of different houses. But you can see here, for example, one vast longhouse, still with those bowed walls. Evidence for another one here, for example. Very complex settlement. Later medieval building here. And also, next to it, a rather earlier, what we'd refer to as Pictish, so whether that ethnic label is actually right or not is open for question, but Pictish building, and I forget the technical term for these, for which I apologise, but the key point is it's basically round, lots of rounded forms there, nice circular building here on the Isle of Man as well. So the point I'm getting across is that these longhouses are distinctive. We can compare them with other kinds of building practice, in this case in the Northern Isles and the Irish Sea region, and see a distinctively Scandinavian style arising. I think I've got one more example along these lines. Oh, there's a nice picture of Old Scatness's round buildings. I wish I could remember the name. It's very embarrassing. Never mind. And an example of some ring forts in Ireland. Yeah, just to make that point of the distinctiveness of Scandinavian ones. Having emphasised already that our texts from medieval Scandinavia that talk about Vikings are written much later than the Viking period, I've thrown in an example of a later Scandinavian farmhouse. This picture is actually taken on the Faroe Islands, a place which I think of as Kirkjubæjar, which would be the Icelandic pronunciation, but I think is something like Kirkjubø. And there are parts of this building that are actually, I think, 14th century, certainly medieval. The bits that you can see are a bit later. This gives you a rough idea of the kind of building that the people who were writing Icelandic sagas in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries were living in, and perhaps the kind of building they were actually envisaging when they were imagining what the Viking period must have been like. So we've got these chronological layers to deal with in how the Viking Age fits into our texts. Do I have anything else I really want to add about the Viking Age? Obviously there's all the raiding and trading, and there's the alleged, well, there is pillaging, I'm sure there is pillaging, no doubt some raping as well. You can kind of explore how that gets portrayed in Scandinavian literature for yourself, and tune into the debate about, well, what life was actually like in the Viking period, by looking at historical literature and so forth, in due course. As long as you've just got that vague sense of, from the 9th century to the 11th century, this explosive period of Scandinavian expansion, both settling completely unsettled areas like Iceland, but also settling and coming into close contact with really the whole of the European world, and therefore the whole of Christendom. And that's going to be what I focus on in the next set of material. Just to kind of lead us on to that, I should get myself out of the way actually so you can read the sign here. Very limited surviving use of literacy before the conversion to Christianity, though we do have important runic inscriptions. I've been emphasising then that people in the Viking period from Scandinavia didn't write very much, and that's basically true. They certainly didn't write much on parchment, if anything. They do, however, have runic inscriptions, sometimes on small artefacts, sometimes on large stones. Sometimes those stones were kind of raised specially for the purpose, memorials for the dead. Sometimes they seem to act like charters as kind of land deeds, but on a great big rock, with inscriptions carved in runes. And there are some, really amazing bits of artwork and some really, really interesting inscriptions. So I wouldn't want to kind of write literacy off entirely. But these are not narrative texts on the whole. They're certainly not long texts like sagas. So although we do have some literacy, we don't have kind of manuscript literacy of the kind that you get to focus on from about the 13th century onwards. So really interesting evidence there. But it's still important to kind of keep the essential idea in mind that Viking society was more or less not a literate society. Literacy wasn't well integrated into how that society was operating. Groovy. well, and there are some examples of runic inscriptions. These are all actually from Orkney. This is a place called Maeshowe on Orkney. That's how it looked at an earlier period before it got quite so knackered as it is now. And some amazing runic inscriptions survive from inside, apparently because, according to a saga, Orkneyinga saga, the saga of the Orkney Islanders, a bunch of them broke into the mountain trying to find treasure, of which they found none. And they got trapped in there by a snowstorm, and they sort of carved all this graffiti on the walls. And there's some amazingly colloquial and indeed obscene graffiti to be found in there. So really remarkable discovery. So you do get these kind of amazing glimpses into Viking literacy, and there's perhaps a lot that we've lost that was recorded on wood and so forth. Nonetheless, my essential point remains that we're dealing with a more or less pre-literate world, a bunch of people who don't write, and therefore fundamentally divided from the written sources through which we can access medieval Scandinavian literature, language, stories. Cool. My next lecture, or my next sort of section of this lecture, next video anyway, we'll move on to Christianity, cause or symptom of change. And that's going to move us out of the Viking period and into this kind of more literate, manuscript-heavy period of Scandinavian history. So, yeah, see you for that. And without further ado, I will switch off the recording and let you get on with the next lecture. All right, farewell. Have fun.